Hello, you are on the channel, Interesting Stories. USSR, 86 country unemotional. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Secretary General of the Central Committee, the CPSU nominated for this position. Stalin's minister is developing vigorous activity. The word perestroika becomes internationally understandable without translation, but it also appears the first Soviet dissatisfied with Prohibition. Citizens supported only in words. In fact, vodka stores have been stormed since morning. Western countries are in panic after accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The wind blows inside of Europe. Meanwhile, Soviet television shows cheerful, festive demonstrations under radioactive clouds. Where nuclear, the explosion had the greatest impact on Ukraine and Belarus, and even at the epicenter of the disaster in Pripyat. Exactly this year in the Moscow region, brutal killings began. Children that day. 11-year-old Vanyusha Pavlov went to the forest go sledding to the hill where his school friends were waiting. It was about 300 meters, no more. However, before the descent the boy didn't arrive. Vanya disappeared without a trace. Worried, the child's parents called the police and same-day search organized immediately. Unfortunately, to find alive the child then never managed to head. The boy was found near the railway in hundreds of meters from her body, as if tore off by the crazed beast. Employees, the police, were cold with horror as they inspected the place. Crime. Soviet detectives, of course, not believed in mysticism, but even they had a secret thought that only a ghoul or a pack of infected wolves could carry out such reprisals. Rabies. But from where? In the near Moscow region, wolves are also rabid, especially in an area specially protected by special services. Even today when I drive by Rubel, I don't stop on the Assumption Highway. Surprise traffic police cars seem to be for every bush. Is probably one of young drivers. Thinks local. The oligarchs bought not only luxurious mansions, but also the police. In fact, this highway has been under intense surveillance for decades. Since it was here all the Soviet leaders settled in such a previously unheard of murder. The search for Vanya Pavlov's killers has been abandoned. The best police detectives soon. They received expert opinion. Predatory animals are not to blame for the death of a child. The boy was torn to pieces with a knife. The murderer had special skills. Without knowledge, human anatomy make it extremely difficult for villains. For several hours sawed and cut lifeless bodies into bathrooms and eventually refuse. From the original plans, they carried out the dead in carpets or large suitcases, but the Moscow region ghoul possessed these skills perfectly and at the same time was extremely cunning and cautious. At the scene of the massacre, not a single piece of evidence, not the slightest clue. Besides, it remained unclear. Did the killer act alone or did he have accomplices? Is it really possible in Switzerland near Moscow some kind of an unprecedented sect, and it announced a hunt for defenseless children? Analyzed scanty data from Odintsovsky's boss. The threat appeared in his home area. Loner maniac. But where to look for this? Alone. Whether he's a local or a visitor. Months passed. People gradually became forget the terrible events here to new and human. Reprisal of 14-year-old Andriusha Gulyayev loved skiing with another walk. The teenager did not return, neither at lunch nor in the evening. Assuming the most scary, parents brought a statement to the police. Alas, terrible suspicions soon. The boy's remains were confirmed to be found in forest 3 days later. Just like Vanya Pavlov, he was torn to pieces. It became clear that the killer was attracted by something. Odintsovo district of the Moscow region, or local or regularly visiting here on a business trip, but at least grab hold of it for some thread still not managed. Unexpectedly to the police station, turned out to be the most important witness of his truth. Parents brought me by the hand. It was a teenage friend of the deceased Andriusha Gulyayev. The boy said he knows who kidnapped Andrei, and I remember the suspect well. Stranger, he spun several times near the holiday village, and on his hand there was a tattoo. Fischer. For any Soviet person, Bobby knew the name Fischer well. Fischer, legendary American chess player, became the 11th world champion, defeating our Boris Spassky in the Soviet Union. Chess is a cult game, and it was played by both pioneers and honored pensioners. I myself once received second rank in this PM year. Fischer was to defend the title of champion in a duel with Anatoly Karpov, but American put forward too many conditions. Holding the match, and Karpov became the champion. without a fight. Despite this, Soviet Leonid warmly congratulated the chess player Ilyich Brezhnev. But how are the Bobby connected? Fisher and the suspicious stranger with the Fisher tattoo remained for now a mystery, and meanwhile a teenager, the most important witness to Andriusha's murder, Gulieva, continued to give the testimony. From the boy's words was orientation at full power earned. Huge Soviet search engine requests were sent to all colony psychiatric hospitals connected. Informants in order to store reports at the Odintsovo Police Department district were allocated a separate office, and he soon found himself filled to the ceiling, but the search was stalled. Meanwhile, among the people, the most fantastic versions, while ordinary people shuddered from the brutal murders, and the police did not stop for a moment analytical activities. However, the titanic work turned out to be absolutely ineffective in the Soviet. There was no man in the Union with a Fisher tattoo on the right hand. What is the puncture? Why the well-functioning mechanism malfunctioned. A teenager witnesses a murder again and again, called for conversations, and one day the boy burst into tears, and then he explained he lied. He was just pleased to be there. In the center of everything, attention. It was a terrible blow. Of 1,000 police officers throughout the country were trained. Boyish fantasy, millions of those full-fledged Soviet rubles, turned out to be thrown to the wind. The investigation had to start virtually from the very beginning. Team leader Vladimir Danilov gave instructions to raise all the archival stuff again and again, explore even the smallest first-look crimes, and now, after a few weeks, head of the Odintsovo threat unearthed a long-closed criminal case in '84. A certain criminal tried to kill the boy and then threw himself under the train. Then Leonid Glushko still had no idea. Very soon he will find a real witness, and the investigation will finally have the first one, a teenager who managed to escape alive from the clutches of the Moscow region. Ghoul, head of criminal investigation, Odintsovo district, drew attention to a strange archival file in the 84th year. A defenseless boy was attacked by someone, man, a little more, and the boy would have died. Fortunately, at this moment on the dacha path, random appeared passerby. It saved the child's life. The attacker started running to the side railway, and soon about body found at the railway station. Suicide in the police, shaking from the fear of a stuttering teenager, was shown. Photo of the man who threw himself under a train. The boy nodded. It seemed similar then in '84. No one bothered to thoroughly check the identity of the suicide. Much later they established it was the thief. Deputy director of vegetable base. Soviet laws threatened him with arrest, and the execution now seems incredible. In modern Russia, for the death penalty, a moratorium was imposed a long time ago, but in the Soviet Union they were shot even for economic crimes. I'm good. I remember the case of director Elisevsky's store in the 84th year of Yuri Sokolov and numerous fraud. Today, the court would sentence him to 6-7 years, and then he received capital punishment. Punishments, or as they said in the tower back then, podmoskovny. The embezzler managed to transfer all the money to relatives and then to the deputy director. Vegetable warehouse threw himself under a train, and didn't even assume posthumously he would become involved in a completely different criminal case. Cases of attack on teenage head of the criminal investigation department decided to find the victim and once again ask about the attack of a 3-year-old. Turned out to be a teenager contained in a psychiatric hospital, a child, and could not recover from psychological trauma. Detective asked cautiously the boy about the attack. At that moment the patient asked for paper and pencil. Only a few minutes passed and Leonid Glushko has a portrait. Moscow region ghoul attacker of average height, dark-haired, about 30 years old or maybe older, and find all these signs. According to them, there was a murderer. Impossible. 88th year has come. The socialist camp has already begun. People are bursting at the seams in Poland. More and more they don't trust the old-school communist Jaruzelski and the leader of the trade union Solidarity, Lech Walesa. In Czechoslovakia, folk, the playwright and Isident Vaclav Havel wins love. Very soon both will become presidents, and in the Soviet Union for a long time, the legendary Filmasa comes out. Cinemas are crowded. Victor Tsoi becomes frantic popularity. Everyone watches this in horror. Terminally ill Andrei Gromyko, the most Stalinist minister, who recommended Gorbachev for the post, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Soviet Union Andrei Andreich understands what a monstrous mistake he has made, but to do it already. He hasn't been able to do anything in recent years, almost never leaves his dacha. It is located in the west of Moscow. Areas exactly where children are being torn apart to pieces. Pod Moskovny. The ghoul disappears without a trace. In 1988, Sasha Sukhomlinov's child disappeared near Dacha Gromik. The boy went to the station, and his mother never saw him again. Never when the child disappeared. Unfortunate parents. We called all our friends and acquaintances, and at night his mother had reasons to hope. Sometimes Sasha took off, forgetting to tell me about my plans at home, but days passed and Sasha never returned. Literally a week later, it disappeared immediately to teenagers. It became clear the maniac again went hunting in the west of Moscow. Area panic began. Parents were afraid. Let the children go outside now. The maniac already had 5 on his account. Young lives. Who's next? Whose child isn't? Will he return from a regular walk or not? It will reach the store. We were not only worried. Ordinary residents of the 9th Directorate of the KGB. The USSR was responsible for the security of the retired Minister of Foreign Affairs Gromik and his loved ones. The Secret Service officers were nervous. Suddenly the beloved grandson who often visited his grandfather disappears. The case of a ghoul near Moscow was put under the highest control. Alas, there are still almost no leads, was the only thing they could show. Detectives' creepy portrait compiled with the words of a child who has gone crazy. Meanwhile, the analysts of the Ministry of Internal Affairs were looking for the question of where the bodies of the latter were. 3 victims before. Dismembered remains were found by everyone. The conclusion was located near the site of the attack. Disappointing. Probably the Ripper got a car. The killer could have made a bloody raid, without only in the Odintsovo district of the Moscow region, but also in neighboring Russian Mazheysk, Narofminsk, Dmitrovsky, or in the most Moscow for preventive work. Hundreds of employees were sent. Police also located near Moscow. Investigators were in close contact with colleagues from Rostov region. Similar crimes occurred there. Then Andrei Chikatilo didn't calculate it, and it added up. The impression is that in the Moscow region and in the south of Russia the same one is operating. Killer. The country's top leadership decided in Odintsovo district it is necessary to conduct a large-scale military operation. May be successful. Discover the secret lair of a maniac, or find the remains of 3 missing people. Boys soldiers walked in a tight chain approximately 3 m apart. 1 kilometer. The other nothing suspicious when suddenly one of them fainted in the snow. He saw fresh traces of blood, and nearby is the dug-up earth. Is it really possible? Luck. Is it really just a Moscow region ghoul that was here nearby? I heard. The soldiers saw the creaking of snow. Behind the bushes a man with a heavy bag behind his back, and with a shovel in his hands. Apparently an unknown person wanted. Hide unnoticed. A warning shot followed. The man threw the bag into the snow and tried to disappear behind the trees. Pursuit was short-lived. After just a few meters, the unknown person fell on the snow and raised his hands. The man begged him not to shoot and assured him that will return to the state all unpaid taxes, will pay any fine. Turned out to be in his bag of carcasses and moleskins. He caught underground animals, immediately skinned them, and I just wanted to earn a little extra money. Alas, Krodolov turned out to be the wrong person for whom they got a job. Rated is today traders who come up with the most clever trading methods. They hire for millions of specialists, marketers, and they sit at desks and strain their brains with just one. The goal is to get people to buy something or other product. But I remember those times when there were no basic things for sale. I even had to get food: buckwheat, a kilo of meat, a stick of butter. In the era total deficit, for example, special hats made from muskrat were considered chic. But this is an ordinary water rat. Subsequently from someone invented this animal. Make stew and don't waste it. Goodness and rat meat were swept away with lightning speed. With counter-operatives carefully checked, the detained Krodolov really turned out to be a respectable man, the father of 3 children, but still large scale. The operation was not in vain. Managed to be found fragment of the body of one of the missing boys. Criminal he hid. Of course he found out that the soldiers combed the forests, and the whole place was buzzing. Odintsovo district but holds back its Bestial instinct, the monster could do everything. 6 months in 89, 2 murders in a row and again. Dismemberment of Rostov. Detectives continued keep in touch with the Moscow Region Criminal Investigation Department. The crimes were really very similar but gradually emerged, and differences in children in the Odintsovo district are not just dismembered according to expert opinions. Most of the injuries the boys received were life-threatening. Pieces of meat were torn out of them with this calculation, so that the unfortunate ones remain conscious until the very agony. Someone gets hellish pleasure tearing off arms and legs, cutting out entrails. Those still alive teenagers. When the head of the criminal search for Odintsov, I looked with my own eyes on the last victims of the elusive ghoul. I could barely stand on my feet while searching for the maniac. Unprecedented forces were deployed. Moscow Region Police to the head investigative team to Vladimir Danilov. More than 100 officers were subordinate to police sergeants, warrant officers, ordinary thousands. It was truly unprecedented police. The operation is perhaps the only one in the history of the Soviet Union, and decided to work off everyone who lived in Odintsovo district without exceptions. Special attention was given to those who could somehow have skills in the dismemberment of some bodies. Was already checked according to the third, the fourth time during the operation. Hundreds of criminal cases were solved for domestic murders, theft, robbery, tax and thefts. For the first time in the Odintsovo district earned 121 articles of the criminal code of the RSFSR. She corralled those about whom today men say non-traditional sexy orientation, but it wasn't like that at all. Child dismemberer in some incomprehensible way somehow never ended up with the police networks in the 90s behind bars. Turned out to be Rostov maniac Andrei Chikdila. He confessed to the murder of 53 people. Chikatilo understood perfectly well there's only one thing waiting for him. Punishment was execution, and was ready to take on yourself any crime. But having familiarized yourself with details of the massacres in Moscow region, said, I didn't think of that before. This is not mine, only now it has become obvious. In the Odintsovo district there is its own a unique maniac for caution, and the perversity of his crimes surpasses Chikatilo himself. But who is he, and why? During a total check of all residents of the area, it was not possible to identify him. It seemed like the children were being dismembered by some phantom. He delivers a monstrous blow, then dissolves into air. The Soviet Union was living its last days. Odintsovo maniac is still went hunting in the 92nd year. Cities more and more often machine guns are heard. Walking the streets is becoming dangerous. Probably the maniac decided now that the police helpless, he certainly won't be caught relaxing. He made the only mistake in this. It turned out to be enough that after 6 years, the operatives finally figured him out. In the early spring of 93 people disappeared. Teenagers. They were returning from Moscow and getting off the train. They started catching a ride. The mutilated remains of the boys were found. 5 days later, the handwriting is still the same. Terrible torture before death. Dismemberment. But in dead boys turned out to be a miraculously surviving friend. He was driving together with them on the train and leaving station refused to board a passing train car, although the driver knew it was his uncle Sariosa with stud farm. Uncle Sariosa, hired livestock specialist, sometimes works at a local stud farm carefully so as not to provoke him. Suspicions were invited under specious as an excuse to talk to the police. The suspect arrived at the department in his own car marked Zhigli. Turned out to be a livestock specialist, someone Sergei Golovkin, a resident of Moscow, and the detectives assumed he had become everything. Deny allegedly knew nothing about fate. Murdered teenagers. Bitterly empathized with the parents. Dead. Any evidence against Golovkin was not on duty at that moment. The investigator decided to release Golovkina, but the head of the Criminal Investigation Department of Odintsovsky District, Leonid Glushko, noticed a livestock specialist slightly clumsily while the suspect sat down in car and calmly drove away from the department. Glushkov remembered the police and the rest. Scanty signs, dark-haired, height taller, average, about 30 years old, at your own risk and risk. Leonid Glushko gave the order again. Detained Sergei Golovkina. Traffic police patrol crews. The radio reported that the Lada was rushing at breakneck speed towards the Minsk highway. Golovkin was not going home to Moscow, Apparently he wanted break into the next one, now already an independent republic. Belarus. All crews on duty by radio received an order to immediately detain Golovkin. He of course understood that they're about to figure it out, and probably tried leave the Moscow region as far as possible to. Luckily the suspect's car stood around for a long time. Railway crossing. A train slowly followed it. These few minutes allowed the police to catch up with Golovkin. He was detained in his own. During interrogation, the technician tried to still deny everything, but when I found out that detectives received a search warrant, his gaze turned pale. As if the detectives had frozen, they realized it was about to split. Turns out Golovkin spent the night right at the stud farm. He was allowed to put a bed right in the red corner. In Soviet times, the red corner was almost a holy place. Bust of Lenin passing the red banner in. I've seen places like this many times. Listen to lectures on the latest achievements of the Soviet people to approve the decision of the next Congress of the CPSU Central Committee. There were such times during a search in the red corner stud farm, where Golovkin spent the night. Nothing suspicious was found. However, there, in the village at the stud farm, a livestock specialist built a garage, and long-awaited success awaited the detectives. The first search in his garage yielded evidence incriminating Golovkin of criminal activity: knife, axe with traces of blood. And after some time the investigators found a rusty trough in this impossible-to-believe killer's lair was very close to the resting place. The then President of Russia evidence. It turned out to be so much that Sergei Golovkin began to give detailed testimony where and when and which of the boys he killed and dismembered. The search for remains continued day and night, but too much has passed time, and from the killed boys almost nothing was left in the office afterwards. Investigator Golovkin talked about every murder in detail. The scheme as always was the same: at first tied, mocked with ropes, and then slowly killed and dismembered. Monstrous experiments on children took place under the garage and specially equipped basement. The last 3 boys kidnapped children suffered a particularly terrible death. 2 of them watched each other die. They sat down a few minutes before death. As a Soviet man could turn, I have no words, into a demon present. The devil as a child. Sergei Golovkin was what called a nerd. He always crammed his homework. His school certificate shows only as he graduated with an honors medal, and a quiet student. Here's Golovkin's description of him. Slight physical disability. He slightly clubbed on his right leg once before graduation. The whole class went to boys, lit a fire together in nature. The girls organized a round dance for tried to everyone's amusement. Join and quiet. Golovkin is one of his comrades were harshly besieged by a crammer. Clumsy. Where did you go, sir? Said Golovkin. After this incident dreamed of a cruel place. After school Golovkin entered Timuriazovskaya Agricultural Academy, but he has relationships with girls. For some reason it didn't work out though. Concentrated, excellent student under 2 meters. Many beauties noticed Golovkin's height. Preferred to live with his mother and sister in Moscow. And then he got a part-time job as a livestock specialist in the Odintsovo district, where he was the first to see how animals were dismembered. I once asked veterinarians about a favor to allow me to cut up the carcass independently at the sight of raw meat. Golovkin experienced the real thing for the first time. Orgasm. Then he had an idea. Cut up one of the boys who loved watching so much, lure teenagers into the garage with horses. Near the stud farm it was not difficult because the local boys knew him as a kind and indecisive guy, especially since he chose daring hooligans as victims, schoolchildren. In 1987, Golovkin for the first time. I read about crimes in Rostov areas there. He dismembered people. I immediately felt the former competitor school student first carefully studied atrocities in southern Russia, and then wanted to surpass the famous maniac, and came up with more and more inhumane experiments. So during interrogation he admitted that he bought a blow gun on purpose. He had a dream to burn out the lamp. Teenagers' eyes are alive. Fortunately this Golovkin didn't have time to do his monstrous plan. Accomplish everything. Moscow region maniac confessed to 11 murders, but detectives are sure there are more victims than the resident. Odintsovo district. Elena Sukomlanova. I was never able to find my remains. Son Sasha has been unhappy for a long time. The woman believed that her son alive. Only many years later did Elena come to terms with she consoles herself with tragedy alone. Golovkin did not have time to dismember her child. Maybe the boy is at least wounded after all. One of my friends was able to escape into the forest. Allegedly told some teenagers escaped from death set traps today in the 10th century. The truth is no longer possible. Sergei Golovkin was shot in 1996. He was executed in Moscow in the Butyrka prison. It was the last execution in the famous bottle. So as not to miss new one's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications by clicking on bell. Thanks for watching.